Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's talking point presentation. I'll begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians on the land we're presenting from today. I also pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that First Nation sovereignty was never ceded. So thanks everyone for attending both online and in person today. I'm Tristan Duncan. I'm a research fellow here at Turning Point and Monash University. I'm also going to be acting as the facilitator for today's talking point. Some people might not be familiar with the medium. Talking Point is a series of publicly available lectures that seek to form and really challenge how we understand notions of addiction and deploy them in the context of our work. And in line with that theme, we're very lucky to have Dr Aysel Sultan presenting her work on recovering assemblages, unfolding socio-material relations of drug use and recovery. So Aysel is a lecturer at the Department of Science, Technology and Society at the Technical University of Munich in Germany. And she's currently visiting Melbourne as part of a bilateral academic exchange. So a little bit of context and bio for Aysel. Aysel has a background in the sociology of health and illness and educational sciences, and a keen interest in the application of science and technology studies in public health, treatment and healthcare policies. And completed her academic degrees in Azerbaijan, Lithuania, and Germany. Aysel is particularly focused on the theoretical and conceptual reframing of contested terms like agency, vulnerability, and well-being, and we'll be hearing a bit about that today, and especially within the context of childhood and youth. Most of her work is centered on young people using illegal drugs and living with chronic conditions, as well as policies addressing these issues. And to this end, she has collaborated with leading Australian scholars here at Monash, as well as RMIT, like Cameron Duff, on the topic of drug policy and recovery. Lately, Aysel's been working on the use of technologies, especially smartphones and social media, to better understand how children and young people experience digital communication and build knowledge around health, harm, and safety. So just quickly before I hand over to Aysel, I emphasize that we really encourage interactivity in talking point sessions. So please ask questions at the end of the session and via the Q&A function for online attendees. We'll collate these and we'll address them towards the end, as I mentioned there. I'll note too that our webinars are also recorded and they're later made available on the Turning Point website. So join our mailing list if you'd like to be notified when those recordings are available to view. So with all that said, please give a very warm welcome to today's presenter, Dr. Aysel Sultan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much. Thank you, Tristan, for your introduction. And I'm so happy to be here. It's my first time in Australia, and it kind of feels very right because, a lot of the work that I've been doing is so inspired by Australian scholars and the critical scholarship that kind of is concentrated here in Australia. And it's so inspiring to be here and meeting everybody and just, Thank you very much for giving me the space to talk about my work. So the title of this talk is The Recovering Assemblages. It's also the title of my book that came out 1 year ago. The term is inspired by Cameron Duff's 2014 book, Assemblages of Health, where he shows how different contexts that make up the personal journeys of recovery come together as assemblages. He then makes the point that it is the assemblage that recovers rather than the person. What I will try to do in this talk is to show precisely how such assemblages come to be called recovery and how people do recovery. In other words, I postulate somewhat deliberately provocative questions of what is recovery and how various theoretical and conceptual tools can illuminate the processes and events of recovery. I will do so by tracing different institutional, informal, and cultural contexts in a combination of empirical data generated in Azerbaijan and Germany, together with 20 young people aged between 16 and 21. This empirical data is then combined with critical conceptual tools drawn from the science and technology studies. The central aim of this study is to critically examine and engage with the dyadic discussions of drug use and recovery, and instead entertain a theoretically informed thinking where the two concepts are thought of as a co-constituent and coexistent, rather than two opposite states or modes of being. Part of this task includes taking an ontological perspective and critically engaging with material and semiotic definitions of recovery as a term and a concept into which I cannot go in great detail within the scope of this talk. The second part, however, and crucial to the following analysis, is that seeing recovery as a contingent event, at times chaotic and incoherent, And something that emerges in sociomaterial relations of bodies, spaces, and affects they generate makes it much harder to pin down recovery as a linear and sequential or even long-term and continuously committed process. Most definitions of recovery indicate some form of a commencement point from where drug use developed into a loss of something that was present before. Thinking of mental health and drug use when assuming a preceding material form, entity, or mode of existence, broad divisions to before and after cast aside the immanence, speaking with Deleuzian terms, of the ontological state of being. Restoring something also automatically implies that something stays unchanged and can be returned into possession or control in the same way it used to be. It forefronts the stasis of a given state before recovery, which can be presumably restored back. So the critical value of assemblage thinking that I'm trying to underline here is to understanding recovery as an opportunity to escape and go beyond the binaries such as drug use and recovery, healthy and diseased, individual and context, and so on. The assemblage approach shows that recovery can be experienced in multiple ways, shifting between two ends, transforming as well as decomposing in and out of different forms. More than 2 decades ago, in her paper titled Setting Yourself Free, Helen Kim proposed that recovery can be thought of as a habit, in that habits make up the practice and experience of recovery. This thinking leads us towards less coherent and consistent image of recovery and a more complex storytelling. Moreover, one could say that in a comparative critical discourse in mental health research, for example, where chronicity of mental health diagnosis and recovery are now being increasingly challenged, chronicity of drug use recovery is being continuously reified in its lifelong and unfinished descriptions that tell the stories of journeys and long-term self-development and identity processes. In this vein, the study, partly inspired by critical drug scholarship, focuses on the variety of contexts and forms in which recovery experiences unfold and take shape. Central to this variety is the diversity drawn from a somewhat non-standard cross-cultural comparison, and I will talk about what I mean by non-standard in a moment. Through such comparison, recovery is illustrated and analyzed beyond its culturally familiar Anglo-American meanings. Moreover, it works to eliminate the differences that both assemble and diversify the many contexts of recovery experiences. This comparison, in my case, between Azerbaijan and Germany, quickly showed to be merely a rudimentary step, more to help emphasize the uniqueness, individuality, complexity, and multiplicity of a recovery experience bound to a context. Although the local treatment settings play a crucial role in providing access to diverse social and material resources, the ways in which these are deployed can transform the very experience of recovery. And this contrast underpins the central idea that recovery can only be understood in its specific and immediate context. I'll illustrate this in the variety of data that I've collected for this study. In the study, these and other similarities and differences are discussed from a relational approach, as an assemblage of manifold forces and as an entanglement of human and non-human bodies. The study brings forward the similarities and differences between the experiences of participants by asking how recovery is enacted in institutional and personal spaces, through residential treatment facilities to informal treatment settings. The questions are tackled through tracings of material, spatial, and bodily experiences of young people, and these communicated contexts of recovery that is then understood in itself as a dynamic structure. The two countries have different national and drug discourses in terms of welfare systems, healthcare, treatment policy, social, and political discourse. And this diversity creates a range of meanings and practices of what comes to be called recovery, or its conceptual and linguistic equivalents, stemming from individual narratives located at different institutional contexts that in turn reflect larger national contexts. Instead of drawing parallels between the two countries and underscoring the differences along the data analysis, this study focuses on the local micro-context from which the drug use and recovery narratives emerge, and leaves the specificities of the countries per se in the background as discrete elements of the recovery assemblage as a whole. This is where the comparison becomes merely symbolic and purposefully asymmetric, As the philosopher of science Isabel Stengers puts it, comparing initially implies that the comparisons are unequal, with the purpose of showing the stronger one between the rival paradigms. Instead of presupposing and unilaterally imposing the comparisons on the investigated subjects, in order to elicit matters of fact, our aims should be effective matters of concern. Subsequently, focusing on national positions in isolation with the sole purpose of comparison can potentially disregard many aspects of the matter of concern, namely the recovery experiences. For example, the ways in which young people in Azerbaijan experience recovery are not to be measured with the Western standards of treatment program as they are partly applied in Germany, but rather to be understood in the very multiplicities of the context in which users find themselves. So for this study, a total of 20 interviews were conducted in 4 languages, namely Azerbaijani, Russian, German, and English, and yes, I do speak all of them, in 2 cities in Germany, Frankfurt and Hanover, and in Azerbaijan's capital, Baku. Participants were mainly referred to treatment as a result of intervention from parents, caretakers, or through a court order. Out of 20 participants, 15 were enrolled in a detoxification treatment at the time of the interviews. 11 had lived in transitional residential facilities in the past. 10 had attended a therapeutic school. 7 had undergone self-regulated treatment at home, and 2 had attended a self-help fellowship. All participants reported receiving an addiction diagnosis in the past, although the specific diagnosis varied. A range of drug use histories were revealed in the course of narrative interviews, including use of alcohol, tobacco, cannabis and derivatives, synthetic cannabinoids, methamphetamine, MDMA, LSD, opioid-based painkillers like tramadol, pregabalin, ADHD prescription drugs, benzodiazepines, eye drops, cocaine, heroin, poppy seeds, and raw opium. In Azerbaijan, also 5 participants reported using a form of brown heroin, which is very popular. To incorporate, it's a form of unrefined heroin. To incorporate the different lengths, forms, and stages of drug use, the study participants were not asked about recovery directly, but about their general experiences of using drugs in an open-ended narrative format. This aided to elicit stories of recovery in the fragmented manner in which they appeared throughout the life story narrations. Moving back to the idea of now speaking recovery as an assemblage. In our collaborative work together with Cameron Duff and drawn from the data and analysis in this study, we approached the heterogeneous forces that mediate recovery context as the primary first focus in unraveling sociomaterial relations of recovery. Drug use and recovery should be understood in their heterogeneous connections that goes beyond the human and subjectivity. The analysis below will approach recovery context by way of 3 main elements: space, practice, and embodiment. Within the scope of this talk, I will specifically focus on space, practice, and then link that to habit, and include the ways each expresses an assemblage in and for the recovering body of drug use problems, in quotation marks. Space is understood as a social function of complex relations between bodies and objects that manifest in diverse situated interactional practices. Spaces are important because of the ways they transform experiences and create associations, literally emplacing our senses of embodiment. Space is continuously made and remade through the practices, associations, and relations of bodies, that being human and non-human, as they transform the way a space is inhabited, made sense of, used, or abandoned. Practices, whether deliberately pursued or arbitrarily invoked, are important for the analysis for the ways they shape self-perception, agency, and power through the embodied doing of activity. Expressed within a matrix of habits, routines, traditions, norms, and customs, the notion of practice provides a durable means of exploring how social processes come to inhabit the body at the very level of its activity. Practice is the hinge between broader social processes and narrower local doings, shaping the array of things that bodies do, both in habit and the more experimental, improvisatory aspects of chance encounters. Finally, objects, events, and cultural processes fundamentally mediate the body and bodily experiences, extending the domains of context to encompass processes of embodiment. Here, the concern is to trace the social, affective, and material forces of embodiment as they shape what bodies do and come to do, expressing habits and routines, transforming experience, and mediating subjectivity. Drawing on these three dimensions of context, I hope to illustrate the contextual elements of recovery experiences. These are the elements that will be here construed in terms of spatial, practical, and embodied aspects of recovery as it is lived, in order to move beyond individualistic understandings of recovery that tend to regard recovery as a function of either psychological characteristics, often with insufficient regard for the social aspects of all and varied recovery experiences. So let me begin with the notion of space. Studies show, for example, that recovery experiences are deeply enmeshed in relations with space, as spaces come to mediate, inform, and embody the very idea of personal recovery. Spaces here function as bundles of practices and affects that shape lived experiences of community, social relations, belonging, and subjectivity. This approach emphasizes the interaction of bodies and practices in the expression of drug use context noted above. Study participants often spoke of significant place attachments in narrating their drug use histories, with most drawing stark contrast between these places and the spaces of drug treatment they had subsequently experienced. Yet even treatment spaces were said to be spatially differentiated in important ways. For example, Timur, who at the age of 18 had already undergone detoxification treatment at two different units at Azerbaijan's National Drug Center in Baku, noted key differences between these two units. He preferred the first unit he stayed in because the nurse there was apparently more inclined to provide injections for sleep, quotation marks. And so he did not experience withdrawal symptoms too intensely. That unit was in a paid department, which means it also had better conditions compared to the state-funded free department units in which he was currently residing at the time of the interview. The latter were said to have no shower, heating, or clean bed sheets, and in addition, the staff were abusive and offered little help to manage what he regarded as painful withdrawal. No one comes in here till the evening. Nobody checks on me. Wouldn't it be better if I just go and use my own drugs? At the other unit, they were coming and checking on you. There you could just knock on their door and they would come and give you a cocktail shot and you'd fall asleep. But here, nobody cares. Nobody even gives any shots, only 2 headache tablets. Timur describes how the previous unit is associated with good treatment in his mind, a place with nurses who provide supportive care, the right medications to help manage withdrawal, and a comfortable, clean environment. These forces materialize the context of a comparatively good treatment place. Yet, Timur also indicated how patients may have strikingly different experiences of the same spaces, depending on the forces at work in them. Indeed, in this second episode of Care, Timur experiences a very different treatment space, and hence a different recovery context, shifting his understanding of recovery as he begins to wonder if his former heroin use isn't healthier than treatment. Moving on to practices, I want to show an example how through practices, recovery experiences can be modified and turned into a habit later on. Through practices, one is able to relate to other people, but also spaces and bodily experiences, which become associated with recovery. In some cases, young people readjust or repurpose particular practices so that they no longer facilitate drug use, but support in contrast practices of recovery. For example, how Marius, age 17, makes sense of his daily practices in relation to ideas of what constitutes a recovery lifestyle further illustrates the importance of embodied recovery context. Yet it also highlights the tensions inherent in practice to the extent that the same practices can support very different social outcomes. For Marius, his enjoyment of skateboarding and the social networks and practices it sustains affords a means both of facilitating regular drug use as well as alternative recovery pathways, depending on their context. I have been skating for 2 years now, and at the beginning of it, I skated stoned. And then I noticed that this is not working well. Like I couldn't do any tricks, couldn't keep the balance, and that's why I don't want to skate stoned anymore, like at all. I prefer staying sober, and with the skaters, it is like there are people sometimes who are there simply smoking pot the whole time, but that doesn't bug me anymore. I prefer skating. Marius shows that being stoned is often part of skateboarding context, alluding to others who seemingly prefer cannabis to riding in this context. While he enjoys skateboarding, he also notes how this pleasure is reduced in his personal experience if he combines this practice with cannabis use. Skating while stoned led for Marius to a feeling, an embodied feeling that decreased in his performance, in a skilled embodied experience of movement. And so he now prefers to consume less cannabis in order to be able to skate better. Similar to how Hassan's job enabled him to maintain what he regarded as balance in his life, helping him to feel in control over both his drug use and his broader recovery experiences, Marius too can combine skating in an environment where being stoned is part of an accepted skateboarding culture without using cannabis himself anymore. This is a striking example of how shifting recovery contexts often depend on a shift in practices. As Marius comes to observe the effects of cannabis use on his embodied practice and the pleasures he derives from skateboarding, his relationship to the spaces in which he rides, the social networks that his practice supports, the people he spends time with, begin to change as these contexts change, shifting Marius's recovery trajectories. Thinking back to the conceptual premises with which I started this talk, one could say that recovery is a timeless, spaceless, and limitless concept until these contextual dimensions of spaces, bodies, and practices are rendered visible through the ways they relate to each other and shape the real experiences. It is in this sense that I want to breach the spaces and practices that I talked about in the final conceptual analytical point that I want to make in this talk, namely the idea of habit and habitual recovery. In their book Habits Remaking Addiction, Suzanne Fraser and her colleagues offer the term habit as a replacement for the word addiction, and for two reasons: to dispense with the stigmatizing, value-laden, pathologizing associations attached to addiction, and to extend the argument of its existence as a practice made and remade in day-to-day interactions and entanglements. They argue addiction and habit both describe repetition and patterns, but only habit can recognize change, not as the end of repetition, but as part of it and as entailed in it. This combination of repetition and change informs the essence of the habitual form of recovery. While habitual recovery, like any other form of recovery, consists of heterogeneous collectives of affects, forces, and relations, it focuses primarily on the regular repetition of relations that sustain the habitual nature of it. For conceptual clarity, habitual recovery will be said to have two sides: recovery from drug use and recovery within drug use, in order to indicate the back and forth, a somewhere and in-between state of the habitual. In habitual recovery, boundaries between recovering from drug use and recovering from withdrawal enmesh. This subsequently scrutinizes the familiar definition of recovery, that both using and not using cannot partake simultaneously. A distinction is needed here to navigate between habitual drug use and habitual recovery. In a more critically informed literature, habitual drug use refers to a stable and continuous act of consumption, indicating a lifestyle. In pursuit of normalization or perhaps diversification, habitual use of drugs or addiction can be considered as a habit that is part and parcel of the normal, of life, and of reality, quoting again Fraser and colleagues. In essence, the momentum is the interest for using. But in habitual recovery, the driving force is the wish for recovery and not the use. However, in the experiences of young people whose stories are analyzed here, the division is not so simple, often with drug use interrupting recovery purposes. Habitual recovery thus refers to a process, not an orderly and gradual one, but to an imminent repetition in pursuit of recovery. As the data show, that some users are constantly oscillating between using and not using, and hence the relations and activities here too should be considered to constitute the habitual practice of recovery. Elsewhere, such oscillation has also been termed as partial recovery, that signals either stabilization of recovery or a chronic condition. Most approaches to recovery emphasize the voluntary character or capacity of the recovery work. The recent scholarship noticed how these accounts overlook the complexities of recovery processes that do not always constitute intentional, voluntary actions, thereby arguing that recovery does not happen to individuals. Instead, recovery endures through the relations that constitute an assemblage. I want to illustrate this idea in the case of Saima. Saima started using tramadol at the age of 13, after being introduced to these tablets by Saima's sister and her friend. Since then, tramadol has played a variety of roles in Saima's life, going through a number of changes, linking economic independence, sexual awakening, circle of friends, legal and housing issues, abuse, and violence. At the time of the interviews in 2017, Saima lived in Baku and identified as gender-fluid sexual minority. Saima, a pseudonym, assigned a male gender at birth, has been engaged in sex work since the age of 16. Due to high levels of discrimination and stigma and frequent police violence toward sexual minorities engaged in commercial sex work in Baku, Saima has learned the importance of knowing the law, constitution, and rights to protect oneself against unwanted interventions, illegal charges, and violence. While these interactions have affected the way Saima negotiates with the police in times of unexpected intrusion, the following analysis focuses on the particular ways Saima mobilizes drugs to achieve stability and security in daily life. Tramadol aids Saima in managing conflict situations and difficult emotions. Saima sees the inherent role of drugs when referring to daily interactions at home, work, leisure, frequent police interventions, strained family relationships, and moral abuse by clients. If my life today will stay the same in the future, there will be drugs in that life too, quoting Saima. As we talk, it begins to emerge that Saima's drug is associated with certain practices that constitute Saima's daily life. The concept of habit is yet to form through tracing these. A recovery story such as this is a journey that is not mediated by medical doctors or any treatment facility. This case consolidates the idea that recovery can happen at any time, by any means, and does not need to be defined within the frames of a specific program agenda. Saima represents a group that faces extreme oppression and violence on both societal and legal levels. Despite laws prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or lifestyle, violent intrusions and abuse from the local police can be a serious obstacle in the lives of these minorities, like Saima. Moreover, being associated with a heavily stigmatized group of people, Saima's chances of receiving treatment at a state hospital are practically none. As someone with minimal financial resources who earns a daily income via sex work and uses both legal and controlled drugs, Saima is a vulnerable member of the society, prone to a range of social, political, and individual risks, violence, and abuse. The individual coping strategies that Saima developed to navigate through this difficult life reflect not only the distant forces and structural inequalities, but also the material and physical dimensions that necessarily partake in how Saima earns money on a daily basis or enjoys leisure time. Hence, tramadol becomes an increasingly powerful actor through time as it maintains the relations through spatial and temporal properties, as well as through changes in social, economic, and material resources in Saima's life. A change of housing conditions introduces new relations in which the house order transforms, and Saima finds that previous incompatibilities with flatmates change in content, and hence the actor networks, of which I didn't have time to go into, of the new order in flat sharing follow experiences toward freedom and consensus. Here, Saima illustrates that change. Now it's different. If there's an argument and I get upset, I'm going to go and get a bottle of that tramadol, and I'm going to feel relaxed. If no one bothers me, then I'm calm. That's it. And in our home, these cases will happen at least once a week. So what should I do then? Or I'll get out to the street to calm down a bit and then pop up the tablets when I come back home, so as not to think of the fight and feel angry again. Recovery cases outside of treatment facilities, as in Saima's case, demonstrate an individually set idea of recovery. For example, Saima speaks of how having the right food in the fridge makes Saima feel more at home and in place. Both the concept of assemblage and ANT provide useful tools to analyze a recovery case like this. Compared to Sima's previous roommates, with whom most money was actually spent in the clubs for recreational drug use, Sima is now able to spend more money on food and keep less for drugs. In the previous flat share, all we always had in the fridge was ketchup, mayo, sausages, and eggs. I was sick of saying this every single day. And when we had money, he'd say, "Let's everybody chip in." And then he'd go and buy all the stuff. That's what I meant was loading. My nerves were on the edge. But now, in this house, it's just the way I like it. Feed the stomach first, and the rest can wait, It's my environment now. If someone comes to my house, I want them to see it pretty. These new habits go along with feeling better. They aid in transition from being loaded to an environment in which Sima feels well. While habit in relation to drug use could mean a certain lifestyle and sometimes a daily use of drugs, habitual recovery does not necessarily mean continuous daily practice. In fact, the understanding of a habit might also be understood as an act that is associated with certain contexts, events, people, and objects. In this sense, linked to addictive forms of behavior is not necessary. Following this logic, habitual recovery can also be related to specific events, spaces, affects, people, and objects. It may not follow every event of drug use as a deliberate act of recovery, but it may occur regularly in relation to a specific set of entities, as the habit has its own ontological dignity, which stems from the fact that it veils but does not hide, quoting Bruno Latour. Here are some concluding remarks. These experiences talked about here today show the diversity in understanding the meaning of recovery. While in more general research and political discourses, the term itself continues to be understood in opposition to drug use and its various negative effects. As shown from the data before, through their narratives, young people portrayed a variety of sense-making about their practices. Relapsing, recovering, going beyond the conventional dichotomies of being a drug user or abstinent person, between relapsing or recovering, between being strong and exerting free will or being victim of drugs. This showed the possibilities of and for recovery in the nuance of everyday life practices embedded in lifestyles of drug use and recreation. On the one hand, applying assemblage thinking and new materialist ontological approaches demand including an array of affective forces such as social, material, spatial, and temporal aspects of any emerging context. This approach is to broaden the perspectives and allow more nuanced portrayals of lived experiences. On the other hand, summarizing all these aspects and relations under an umbrella term, such as recovery, creates an imprecision that this study wanted to avoid in the first place. It's important to remember that there isn't one single assemblage of recovery. Whether it is merely an approach, a way of conceptualizing recovery, and hence every individual's recovery experience are a separate assemblage on their own. In this way, the context-specific forms of recovery presented here and the different ways in which recovery assemblages can manifest provide us with thinking of recovery as a practice of habit and shows the real difficulty of seeing recovery experiences as linear process of accumulating and rebuilding health and well-being. This work is unfinished in the sense that it demands further investigation into how recovering assemblages can further uncover unique needs of people seeking recovery in professional settings, while also offering a unifying conceptual tool with which to design effective interventions and support systems. This project scrutinizes the seemingly universal concept of recovery with an attempt to diversify the specific Western connotations and practices and even institutionalization of recovery, and in doing so arrive at a less coherent and consistent, but in that more open, more sensitive, and more accepting view of experiencing recovery with and from drug use. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Aysel. Wonderful presentation. What we can do now is open up the field for questions, particularly online. If you could type in your questions that you might have in the box there, and we can try and collate them and throw them out. So I don't know if anyone actually might like to begin as well in the audience. Ramez? Yeah.
So thanks for the really interesting talk. I'm really interested in the idea that recovery can be multiple. I'm wondering the extent to which you found that across the different kind of multiple cultures you collected data. For instance, in cultures that are more informed by 12-step notions of recovery, people might see recovery as this ongoing, lifelong commitment to abstinence, whereas maybe other kinds of cultures might see recovery as something you, like, as another kind of habit, or might not involve abstinence at all.
Yeah, this is a really great question because there's a whole chapter on this in the book. And I'm trying to approach that question by scrutinizing the language a little bit, because even the word recovery is very hard to translate either to German or Azerbaijani or any other language in that sense. So to me, I went with the argument, I'm going to think of it as an Anglo-American also in terms of language, not only just about the system and what we understand about Western healthcare systems, more or less, that there are some similarities. And I think that when it comes down to language itself, for example, the Azerbaijani participants never talked about feeling recovered or taking the time. It's more about the words. The conceptual equivalent is just to quit and get rid of and stop using, things like that. And because there are no in-place institutional treatment programs that could support the idea of long-term recovery, people don't necessarily also think of it that way. It is more about, it goes back to the root discussion about free will and things like, the discussions where you think, okay, we just expect you to be strong now and, we will provide you with 3 weeks long detoxification treatment. It's very unclear, boundaries unclear kind of treatment. It's very medical, and then you're good to go. You're on your own. And so obviously it doesn't work and people keep coming back and so on. So the whole idea of recovery is kind of unhinged in the sense that it is, if we talk about recovery in this particular concept, we're almost imposing it to certain groups, and which just doesn't have that conceptual equivalency. Does that make sense?
So we have a question from online. Is it possible to have long-term recovery from drugs dependence when the need for use has and still is ongoing?
I guess this is where the term habit may be helpful conceptually, because this is where we can think about what I try to also illustrate in the case of SIMA, the before and after drug use. And there's this ongoing sense of feeling better. And sometimes that feeling better is by using drugs and from using drugs. And sometimes it's by stopping using drugs for some time. And there's this kind of in-between mode of existence, if I may use a Wittgensteinian term here, where we could think that even the need to use may still be present within the idea of recovery. So instead of thinking as these kind of two very opposite ideas or states of being, we could maybe through these examples think of them as really coexistent and interdependent. And I think one of the crucial findings through, also other stories of young people tell, is that at some point, maybe if there is no more drug use or any associations with drug use, there's maybe also no need to talk about recovery anymore, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience here? We have another. Oh, yeah, please.
So can I ask a question about the particular population you're looking at, being youth, and how perhaps they're being in that developmental stage may help or hinder any notion of recovery in their mind? Like, what does recovery mean to someone who's that young?
Yeah. I had some hidden slides with more quotes. So what I can say in a summary, this is a good question. In Germany, I have spent some time at recovery schools. And this therapeutic, what they call therapeutic homes, I'm translating, I'm not sure if this is the equivalent here. These are the places where young people live. And they're kind of looked after by social workers in place, and they go to schools and come back and they go through this therapies, daily reflection, and all of that. And one of the interesting thing that I found is almost every one of them tells exactly the same story of recovery. I mean, I'm sure you know the notion of institutionalized narrative, in a sense that this is the certain idea, almost an FAQ kind of, questions and answers, in the sense that how we tell the story of recovery. And so they would all say, for example, once I'm done, I'm going to go and get my driver's license, and I will definitely have a tattoo commemorating the day when I'm, leaving this therapeutic center, and so on. And just keep repeating this. There was kind of this interesting pattern. Whereas with the participants from Azerbaijan, there was absolutely no any kind of pattern that could repeat. It was more, and I tried to look at it as more a creative way of trying to recover. We published an article with Cameron last year, looking into the line of vulnerability, and we're discussing a specific case also from this data of a young person who went to military service and used this as an opportunity to recover. So stop using drugs. There's no recovery, but they'll stop using drugs in a sense, right? This was very one unique specific case, spending time in this military basement, doing certain kind of duties, living this very regimented lifestyle. And this takes time, just developing new practices and all of that. But there was no other case like that. There were also cases where people were sent to Turkey or Russia to very different kinds of therapeutic treatment centers and so on, to go different lengths of treatment and so on. And I guess this is where it becomes almost useful to speak about recovery as kind of this unifying term. And I think the age in that sense is also not the major factor, in a way that they are present in different contexts, or they're present also, they build different contexts around them, And that emergent idea of context helps here to just focus on this most minutest, kind of very local idea of feeling well, becoming well, and maybe not thinking about recovery in the long term.
And some questions online related to that, I think, around the multiplicity of recovery and how we work with that in everyday practice, particularly when policy and practice often attempts to striate or render it singular. How can you retain the incoherence and the diversity when it seems that the systems are built around making it singular?
Yeah, I feel like the multiplicity notion, also conceptually from Anna Maria Moll, is very helpful here, because I guess at the heart of it, it's not even about speaking about any kind of, speaking against any kind of programs or any kind of agendas. It's more about being able to incorporate certain nuances into already existing, and as you said, striated, but still kind of, singular-minded and a very specific goal-oriented programs. I guess it's more about being attuned to the specifics of the context and understanding that there's a lot more diversity in what we can call recovery, other than trying to kind of shape it and mold it into a particular form.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Aysel. If you could join me and thank you, Aysel, for sharing your presentation today and visiting. She'll be here for another couple of weeks if people would like to get in touch. Thanks to the audience too, and I remind you that the recording will be available shortly after today's session. So, have a lovely day and thank you.